In a remote mountain village, there was an ancient taboo: never comb your hair at midnight. Especially for women with hair that reached past their waists. The elders in the village said that mirrors at night concealed otherworldly things. Once disturbed, they would crawl along your hair, enter your body, and steal your soul. But the young woman, Tsuelan, didn't take it seriously. She was the most beautiful girl in the village, with jet black hair cascading down like a waterfall. Every time she combed her hair, a faint fragrance would waft through the air. Tsuelan never believed in such old superstitions. She often said that ghosts and spirits were nothing but tales meant to scare children. Until that night. It was a moonless night, the sky so dark not even a single star could be seen. Tsuelan's parents had gone to visit relatives, leaving her alone at home. The moonlight filtered faintly through the cracks in the paper windows, casting a silvery glow. She sat before her mirror, picked up her comb, and began to brush her long, black hair. Each stroke made her hair flow like a smooth river, a mesmerizing rhythm. As she was lost in her own thoughts, a sudden chill ran down her spine. Tsuelan turned sharply, but there was nothing behind her. She chuckled to herself, thinking the wind must have slipped in through an open window. She reached out to shut the window, only to find it was already tightly locked. A faint unease crept into her heart, but she quickly shook it off. She sat back down in front of the mirror and continued combing her hair. But when she looked into the mirror again, she froze. Her reflection was smiling. It was an unnatural smile, twisted and eerie, with cold, lifeless eyes. Tsuelan screamed and dropped the comb in her hand. But the reflection in the mirror didn't flinch, it just kept staring at her with that unsettling grin. Panicked, Tsuelan turned to run out of the room. But before she could move, something yanked her hair. Instinctively, she looked back and saw her long hair entangled with the comb. To her horror, the comb was moving on its own. It combed through her hair, stroke by stroke, pulling her closer to the reflection in the mirror. Tsuelan desperately tried to tear her hair free, but the strands seemed alive, tightening their grip. A searing pain shot across her scalp. "Ah!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face. Then, her reflection in the mirror suddenly stood up. Tsuelan's body began to move involuntarily toward the mirror. She struggled with all her might, but her arms and legs were bound by invisible forces. Finally, her forehead pressed gently against the cold surface of the mirror. A chilling sensation spread throughout her body. "Your hair is beautiful," a low, hoarse voice echoed from the mirror. Tsuelan watched in horror as her reflection's hands reached out and wrapped around her neck. "No, no," she cried, but her voice grew weaker and weaker. In the end, her body collapsed to the floor, leaving the room in eerie silence. The next morning, the villagers found her. She was kneeling before the mirror, her hair completely white, her eyes vacant, and her lips curved into an unnatural smile. The elders shook their heads and muttered, "Another one who wouldn't listen." From then on, no woman in the village dared to comb her hair at night. Mirrors were covered with red cloth and never reflected anyone's image again. Yet, on certain nights, passers-by near Tsuelan's home could still hear the faint sound of combing. Crisp and haunting. In a remote mountain village, a chilling legend circulated: never let your nails grow too long. Especially after midnight. It was said that those with overly long nails would attract it, and from that moment, sleep would elude them until their untimely death. Ah Xiao was a young widow in the village, left to raise her 3-year-old daughter alone after her husband's death. Ah Xiao had a pair of delicate hands, her fingers slender and her nails smooth and clean. Despite her hardships, she cherished her hands, carefully trimming and maintaining them. But recently, strange things began happening. No matter how often she trimmed her nails, they would grow back overnight. And each time, they grew longer and sharper. At first, she dismissed it as an illusion and thought nothing of it. But as the nights passed, unsettling incidents followed one after another. One evening, Xiao sat by candlelight, trimming her nails as usual. The clipped nails fell to the ground, making a crisp sound. Suddenly, a faint noise came from her daughter's room, like soft footsteps moving about. Xiao set down the scissors and walked quietly to her daughter's room. The door was slightly ajar, and the room was dim. By the faint candlelight, she saw her daughter lying peacefully in bed, breathing evenly. Relieved, Xiao gently closed the door. But as she turned back toward the table, she realized the nail clippings on the floor were gone. In their place were long, thin scratches that extended from the table legs all the way to the doorway. A chill ran down her spine as she muttered to herself, "Did I scratch the floor by accident?" Reassuring herself, she quickly put away the scissors, extinguished the light, and went to bed. In the dead of night, Xiao was startled awake by a strange sound. It was the sound of nails lightly scratching wooden planks, sharp and rhythmic, yet hauntingly eerie. She threw off her blanket, her room engulfed in darkness. In the pale moonlight, she noticed fresh scratches on the wall, snaking downward, inching closer to her bed. Fear froze her body as her limbs turned ice-cold and her breath caught in her throat. Suddenly, she felt something cold brush against her foot. She looked down and saw a long, sharp black nail slowly dragging across the top of her foot. "Who's there?" she screamed, leaping out of bed and lighting the candle. But there was no one in the room, just her and the scattered nail clippings. Her trembling hands moved instinctively to her nails, now fully grown again, longer, sharper, and faintly glowing with a ghostly black hue. Panic consumed her as she grabbed the scissors and frantically cut them off. But the more she cut, the faster the nails grew, and the discarded clippings on the floor began writhing like living creatures, crawling toward the door. Horrified, she followed the trail of clippings, which slithered along the scratches on the floor and stopped at her daughter's room. "No!" Xiao whispered hoarsely, pushing the door open with trembling hands. Her daughter's bed was empty. In the faint candlelight, she saw her daughter standing by the window, slowly turning her head, a chilling smile on her face. Her daughter's small hands now bore nails as sharp as blades, glinting coldly. "Mother, my nails are so beautiful." Her daughter's voice was ethereal and distant, as though it came from somewhere far away. Xiao collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down her face, unable to make a sound. Her daughter began walking toward her, the sharp nails dragging across the wooden floor, producing a screeching sound. "Mother, stay with me." As the voice faded, the candlelight was snuffed out, and darkness swallowed the entire room. The next morning, the villagers found that both Xiao and her daughter had vanished, leaving behind walls covered in scratch marks. A new warning soon spread through the village. If you hear the sound of nails scratching wood at midnight, never open your eyes. Because it is right beside you, waiting to take your soul.
In a remote mountain village, there was a chilling legend: never pierce your ears casually. Especially at midnight. It was said that if you pierced your earlobes at the wrong time, you would hear things you were never meant to hear. These voices came from the underworld. Ayun was a beautiful young woman in the village, born into a family of embroiderers. Her life was not wealthy, but it was peaceful. Her mother had always warned her not to pierce her ears, claiming that it would bring misfortune to their family. But Ayun didn't believe such superstitions. She thought it was just an outdated myth. She believed that pierced ears would make her even more beautiful. One evening, she secretly invited an old woman from a neighboring village to pierce her ears. That night, the moon was hidden behind the clouds, and the village was shrouded in eerie silence. The old woman held a silver needle and asked with a strange smile, "Are you sure you want this, girl?" Ayun nodded firmly, without the slightest trace of fear. The needle pricked her earlobe, and she felt a slight sting. At that moment, a cold sensation seemed to brush past her ear. "It's done," the old woman said in a raspy, low voice, like the hiss of a dying snake. Ayun looked at herself in the mirror. Her reflection, with the new earrings, was indeed more beautiful. She couldn't help but smile in satisfaction. But her happiness lasted only until the dead of night. Ayun woke suddenly to a faint sound. It was soft, like someone whispering in her ear, but she couldn't make out the words. She rubbed her ears, thinking she was imagining things, and tried to go back to sleep. But the sound grew louder and clearer. The whispers turned into cries, sharp, mournful wails. "Help me, save me." A hoarse voice pleaded in her ear, filled with pain and despair. Ayun sat up abruptly, clutching her ears, her face pale with fear. She glanced around the room but saw no one. The only sound was the faint rustle of wind outside her window. She tried to convince herself it was just a bad dream. Lying back down, she felt a dull ache in her earlobes. Reaching up, she found her fingers wet with something warm. It was blood. The next morning, Ayun told her mother about the strange events of the night. Her mother's face turned ashen, and she quickly retrieved an old, yellowed mirror. "Look at your ears," her mother said urgently. Ayun held the mirror up to her ears and was stunned. The area around the piercings wasn't just swollen. It was covered in countless tiny fingerprints, as though countless hands were clawing at her earlobes. What is this?" Ayun stammered, her voice trembling. Before her mother could answer, the whispers returned. "You took my place. You owe me." Ayun screamed and dropped the mirror, which shattered on the ground. The voices, however, only grew louder. Her mother frantically burned incense and recited prayers, but nothing seemed to work. The whispers turned into screams, a cacophony of wailing and shouting in her ears. It was as if dozens of people were crying, yelling, and pleading all at once. Ayun could no longer distinguish between the sounds in the room and the chaos in her own mind. One night, unable to endure it any longer, Ayun grabbed a pair of scissors. She tried to cut off her earlobes, hoping to silence the voices forever. Blood splattered everywhere, staining the floor red. But the voices didn't stop. Instead, they became even more frantic. "You can't escape. You must return what you took. We are all waiting for you." The next morning, villagers found Ayun collapsed in her room. Her ears were torn and bleeding, and her lips were curled into an unsettling smile. The villagers whispered that Ayun's piercings had summoned something that should never have been disturbed. From then on, no one in the village dared to pierce their ears. But on nights when the moon was hidden, those who passed Ayun's house would hear faint sobbing. "You took my place.